Okay. Hello and welcome back to these series of lectures on the Exalted Treatise on the Response of the Tao. As you know, a very foundational text in the Taoist tradition, and a text that Venerable Master promoted throughout his life as being very accessible and practical for our lives today. So it's accessible, as you can see. It's very concise. We're up to the third section, the second to last section already. And at the same time, each of the sentences provide sort of nuggets of wisdom, and they're not connected in the sense that you have to understand all of the sentences to be able to put it into practice. You can take each of the sentences and use it and apply it here and now. So it's quite accessible and practical. So we continue in this very long section of the deeds, thoughts, and words that we should avoid. And we'll be focusing on these particular sentences today. The first one is bewitching people with sorcery and killing trees with poison. You can see in the Chinese, in the very first line, that actually in the original source, you would consider these two phrases as part of one sentence. And that's very interesting because how does the idea of harming people then relate to harming trees? Wonder if you can find the common element here. So both of these sentences relate to harming others or living organisms in an underhanded and a sort of insidious way. So this sorcery is using sort of black magic, or you could say some sort of poison, to harm the other person without them actually knowing. Now, thus far in our exploration of the Exalted Treatise, we've seen that there are many things, many different misdeeds in which there's harm done to others. And a lot of those are, direct. The other person feels that, physical, emotional harm, and they know that you are the source of that particular injury. But here, you are sort of employing the services of a shaman or someone who's able to practice this kind of curse or black magic in order to cause them harm. And this is sort of done from a distance. But you employ the services of this person, this shaman, to then be able to harm the targeted person. And similarly, in the second sentence, this idea of killing trees with poison. You're not there hacking down the tree, chopping it down in broad daylight, but it's something that you can do insidiously, the night and the quiet, pouring the poison in, and no one will really know until, a while later when the tree starts rotting, failing to grow, and the area around it starts to turn yellow, etc. So both of these lines, you can see there's this common element of doing things in an underhanded way. And as we said before, this bewitching people with sorcery is not you necessarily doing it yourself, not thinking Harry Potter here, but employing the services from the traditional perspective in the time in which太上感應篇was compiled, employing the services of a shaman and then harming the other person. Now, it's a misdeed even though you're not directly assaulting the person, and they may never have knowledge of the fact that you were involved in causing their suffering or misery or their particular sickness, etc. But because you have that malicious intent, and also you are instructing someone else to do harm to the targeted person, then actually that person doing harm, the shaman, their demerits are also in your account. In other words, you've done a misdeed, but you've also instructed someone else to do misdeeds. So you can see there's that double demerit, you could say. And so therefore, even though it's done from a distance, they may never know, and you've asked someone else to inflict that harm, it's still a misdeed on your part. So that's the very first sentence. It's not hard to understand. The second sentence, again, when we're talking about trees, of course, trees obviously have many benefits. And so the first thing is, well, do we really need to harm this tree? Is there a need to actually remove the tree? Because they are obviously a natural habitat and provide an environment for our shade, but also living creatures. Now, but there are obviously many reasons for removing trees. For example, they may, cause damage to surrounding properties, people, etc. And chopping down a tree is not necessarily a misdeed, but it's how you do it. And from the Taoist as well as the Buddhist tradition, trees have spirits that live inside of them, and particularly trees that are over the height of a person. So they've grown to that height, and therefore spirits may be attracted and want to live in that area, in that tree. So Venerable Master in his lectures has often talked about the need to give a notification to the spirits that live in that tree. So before you chop it down, before you injure it in any way, you need to provide notice, and you need to give the spirit time to move, just like how we would feel if someone just one day demolished our house without telling us that our house was in the way of some big project. So it's the same reasoning. We put ourselves in the perspective of someone else whose home is that tree, and we would also need to provide it with adequate time. So it's a matter of letting those spirits know, but also giving them time to move. And then having done that, to then be able to remove that tree. Now, the misdeed or the demerit here is accumulated when you use poison. So here it's sort of alerting us to the harms of using these chemicals. Now, obviously, sometimes these days there are sort of chemicals that we can use that are much more friendly to the environment. But generally we have to be careful because this poison obviously could seep into the soil, the water system, and ultimately the surrounding areas might be affected. So it's not just that tree, but sort of the land itself, the soil, is it still able to sustain life? So this is the thing in terms of this particular sentence. So both of these sentences are not hard to understand, and we can see where this demerit or where this misdeed might lie. I'm going to move on now to the next sentences, and it's about teachers and parents as well as older siblings. So it says, being angry towards teachers and opposing parents and older siblings. Now, in the Exalted Treatise, there are various sentences in relation to teachers and parents, if you remember. In this same section on misdeeds, there are, we've previously covered these two lines. So to surreptitiously humiliate leaders and parents, as well as to disrespect one's teachers. How is that different from the lines that we've just read that we're covering today? Well, in the previous line, this surreptitious means to do it in a secretive way. Okay, so you're humiliating the parents, your parents or your particular leaders, your bosses, but you're doing it again in this underhanded way. It's not confronting them, whereas in the lines that we're covering, it's in relation to confrontation, opposition. And in relation to the teachers, here it's this idea of looking down on your teacher because of their abilities, etc. But it may be because you yourself feel that you're better than them, so you look down on them. Now, that's different from the line here, which is about generally, towards the way that they teach or what they're teaching, you develop anger and resentment. So it's in relation to what they've done. And again, this would lead to various actions, or even the tone of your voice, the way you say things, what you do, how you treat that teacher. There's a more overt, whereas the disrespect may be something that's just this thought inside. So it's distinct from the previous misdeeds. So that's the first thing to be clear about. But again, I want to draw your attention to why these sentences are actually juxtaposed. What can you see as the common denominator here? It's how we relate to these groups of people in our lives. Now, all of us, throughout our lives, we will meet many, many people. You just go on a holiday. Everyone that you sit on the plane with. If you happen to go to a conference, you'll meet many people in your work, in your personal life. But all of us will have had teachers, and we will have parents. So this is something that's universal. But on top of that, when you drill down on why it is a demerit, why it's a misdeed, these two groups of people, teachers, parents, and even including older siblings, or family members, the majority of times what they say and what they do is in your best interests. And they're thinking about you. Now, I say this, and when I say this, I'm thinking about a very common Chinese proverb or saying, and it comes from a Confucian philosopher. His name's called Xunzi. And in this line, the quote, it provides two analogies. It talks about blue dye being derived from the indigo plant. And yet this dye is actually much bluer in color than the plant itself, the indigo, when you actually see the plant. And ice comes from water, but actually it's much colder than the liquid water. We know from the freezing point of ice, the freezing point of water. So what these two analogies are pointing to is that this ultimate sort of refined product or outcome exceeds or surpasses or is better in some way, in some property, than the original source. So it surpasses or exceeds the original source. Now this is commonly used in a phrase in Chinese today to talk about how children or students surpass the achievements of their teachers and parents. It's sort of like the next generation is much better than the previous generation. And it's a saying that's used in a positive way. It's in praise of the students and the teachers, in fact, that the students are better than them. And I think that, this mindset of teachers is that this hope that the skills and the knowledge that you impart, that we as teachers, speaking from a teaching point of view, that we impart somehow help that student to further their education, their learning, but also ultimately if they later do research to further the field, this field of scholarship. Now, speaking from an academic point of view, when you do research, every research should provide an original contribution to the field of learning, because whatever discipline, whatever research area you're involved in. And the great thing about academia and scholarship is that it can always improve. This field of scholarship, this repository of learning and outcomes, research methods, results, knowledge, etc., is sort of for everyone in the world to be able to access and tap into. So anyone who's a scholar in your particular area is able to look up the literature and find various writings from people around the world. And this is to further their own understanding of their subject, but also so that they can contribute and conduct further research so that they can then improve and advance the field. So it's all about taking the research further. And in fact, it is our hope that our students, when they come to university, that they become competent in the tools of thinking, the critical approaches, the subject areas, the knowledge, etc., the research, and then they themselves are able to provide and contribute. Because this is a body of knowledge for all of humanity, that hopefully this is able to inform policy, it's able to inform ultimately people's lives and better their lives. So everyone has access and has the opportunity to do so. And it is hoped that everyone can do so in academia. There's, in a sense, there's no competition because everyone's trying to improve the greater good, the greater goal of bettering our understanding of certain ideas. So that's from an academic perspective, but in a professional setting, if you happen to go to work in a workplace and you have an older colleague who has to be your mentor, much like speaking from experience in the medical setting, if you're a registrar and you have an intern, someone who's just graduated, then you know that their abilities and competencies are going to be limited. And you're constantly sort of helping them, challenging them to improve and teaching them in various ways. And that's for the better, because if this intern, this graduate becomes more competent, then they're able to help more people pick up the signs and symptoms of the patients in a faster way for better patient outcomes. So this teaching doesn't just happen in a sort of lecture hall, but actually even in daily lives, this so-called teacher could be our mentor, it could be someone who's more senior than us in our profession. And generally, speaking from my own personal experience as a teacher, when it comes to students, I do hope that they are able to become more competent and, impart this knowledge so that they far surpass my level at, when I was their age. So you can see how, I guess, from the educational perspective, there's this idea that the students really should be fully fledged, effective learners and ultimately teachers in their own right and scholars in their own right in due time. And therefore, as teachers, there's this idea that you're thinking in the best interests of how to teach the students, how they learn, and you want them to be better. You want them to improve constantly. Now, similarly, from the parents' point of view, there's from the parents' point of view, that's a completely different generation. Your parents obviously have lived through many more years of life. They know a lot more of the world, even though their world may have been a bit different in terms of technology in those days. But the way they had to go through university, find a job, undertake, create a family, etc., and they have the same issues and problems as you would as you go through life. And when I speak to any parent, most of the parents that I speak to talk about how it is their hope that their children are happy. So it's not about success in terms of worldly success. Of course, that's wonderful, but at the bottom line is that parents wish that their children will be happy, and that more importantly, that their children do not suffer in the same way that they did when they were growing up. Perhaps it was in terms of their financial situation, perhaps it was in terms of opportunities. And parents will often go out of their way to try to create opportunities, to create the right conditions for their children in ways that they were never given these opportunities. And they will share their experiences, the lessons they learned in their life, so that their children don't make the same mistakes. And they will also, not just the sharing experiences, but also resources, so material resources, financial resources, etc., to ensure that their children have the best start to their lives and careers. So you can see how, speaking generally, these two groups of people, your teachers and your parents, and including these older siblings, the reason why older siblings is sort of on par with parents here in this particular sentence is because in the traditional setting of sort of living together in extended families, these older siblings would also have authority in the extended family, particularly if the parents were quite elderly, then they might sort of take on board the family business or the family management, so to speak. And therefore, they have this authority in the same way as the parents, and that's why they're sort of placed on par here. So the thing with, you can see here, generally, parents and teachers would, as well as older siblings, would think about the best interests of their family and, in terms of teachers, of their students. And therefore, it's sort of doubly a demerit to be angry and oppose people who have your best interests at heart. So, generally, we might get angry. We might oppose here. Oppose is not just to disagree with them. It has more wider connotations, as you can see in the words underneath, this idea of casting aside, neglecting, abandoning, but also confronting and offending in a sort of negative way. So it's about this idea that you do that to people who love you the most. And in the case of parents, this unconditional love and care that has, been throughout your life, even before you were toilet trained, before you had anything in your life. So it becomes even more of a demerit. And that's why these lines, these misdeeds to parents and teachers are particularly highlighted, or it comes up more than once, that towards these two groups of people in our lives, we need to be particularly careful and respectful. Now, in terms of the idea of teachers, if we hone in on the very first sentence, of course, there may be reasons in which we may dislike our teachers. As I said, all of us have had teachers, and I'm sure if I get you to think back to your, school memories, there will always be, that, your favorite teacher, the best teacher that you had in your primary school, your secondary school, or even at university. The one that, you learned best in their subject, you excelled, and you really enjoyed it. But then at the same time, there will be those other teachers that you really disliked their subject, you didn't really enjoy their teaching or the subject itself. So, you'll have the best teachers and your worst teachers. Now, if we think about the worst teachers that we had, then generally you would say that there are reasons why you dislike or you might feel angry. in that sort of educational setting. There are good reasons. For example, well, if we sort of break it into two main reasons, the first is in relation to what they teach, and the second is how they teach. So in terms of what they teach, maybe their level of competency, their knowledge, their skills towards that subject area is deficient. And, there are certain learning outcomes at whatever level. So, if it's year 7 maths, then you have to ensure that the students achieve those outcomes and those skills. Similarly, in a university course, if that particular module is being marketed as providing this kind of these learning outcomes and objectives, then the teacher needs to be skilled to be able to do that. So perhaps in some way or another, they have an incompetency, and therefore what they teach is insufficient or limited. And therefore, you give rise to this anger because you feel that they should know what they're talking about, and they should be able to help me understand. Now, in these sorts of situations, other than simply making formal complaints or changing the subject or the course at your university, there ultimately we have to sort of give them the benefit of the doubt. This particular teacher obviously went through some sort of interview process, selection process, and they have this qualification, they're in this role. Perhaps maybe there was no one else for this job, and they are filling this position to ensure that this course goes ahead. And in that way, they're also fulfilling an important role. Most importantly, it's useful to think about the emotions that you have and to turn it around. So just simply getting angry is counterproductive. I think that if you think back to the times when you've had and encountered such teachers, the moment that you've had this kind of feeling towards them, doubted what they've said, their level of knowledge, etc., is the moment that you actually stop learning. And you start to feel that this subject is a chore, you don't enjoy it, and therefore your entire learning of the subject is hindered. Perhaps it was the subject in which you got the worst marks, not surprisingly. But actually, we can try to turn around this thinking, to change our thinking, in that this teacher is not teaching me about the subject per se, but teaching me about how to learn for myself. It's this sort of adult learning or lifelong learning that is important, throughout all phases of our life. We call it mature age learning or adult learning, but actually the earlier that we pick up these skills, the better we'll be. And rather than sort of simply blaming the teacher, we can find strategies, you could say. I was going to say resources, but strategies to help ourselves learn. And it may involve looking at the syllabus, looking at the essential readings, required readings, recommended readings, and trying to make your way through these sort of elementary primers on the particular subject. Usually textbooks can be quite self-explanatory. Now, failing that is finding and seeking out another teacher, so on the same sort of another staff member. And when we're at university, most of the staff members will have those prerequisite learning. Everyone went through the same undergraduate course, but they've then sort of subspecialized in their research area. So it may be useful to simply ask one of the other staff members. Failing that, there's also, talking to senior students, someone who's just finished the subject, the module, someone who's a year ahead, to provide you with some guidance. Now, it doesn't mean that they have to be your new tutor or your new lecturer, but it's just a matter of giving you the tips and essential sort of learning points, so that you're not getting lost in the details of the textbook that might be quite high level. So when you realize how to learn for yourself, it becomes quite liberating. It becomes, you're an independent learner. You can take any subject and you can sort of mark out a roadmap in which you can understand the essential points, fill in, your knowledge areas by going through the library, picking up different texts, and being able to learn in that way. And that is so useful when you're later in life in your own, say, if you undertake postgraduate research, but even more importantly in the workplace. Because when we start working, our senior colleagues who may be mentoring us for a period of time during our induction, they do not have the time, energy, or maybe patience to take us through and give us lectures on everything that we have to know, but will expect us to learn on the job. Sometimes we just have to see them do it once and we're expected to know how to do it again, or read a manual. So this kind of sort of self-learning is important in the workplace and later in life. So actually, the teacher that we thought was incompetent is actually providing us with another opportunity for learning, and that's learning how to learn, rather than simply learning that subject and how they teach. So that's that kind of proactive attitude to learning is much more productive than simply being angry and therefore disliking the subject and therefore getting poor marks. Now, that's in relation to how the teacher relates to the content of the course. But the other reason why we might become angry is because of how they teach, the delivery. So it could be that the theories, the principles are quite dry. They're not providing enough scenarios or case studies, samples, etc. But on top of that, sometimes there may be some unfairness happening in the classroom, in which case, a particular student or students are favoured, and everything that they say is praised and they get good marks, whereas whatever effort you put in is criticised, etc. And you feel that there's this unfairness. Now, in that case, of course, it's important to speak to lines of authority to try to explain the situation, see if there's something that can be done to remedy the situation at a higher level. But failing that, and sometimes it might be not so overt, then actually here is also a very good learning opportunity for us, that we have to be focused on what it is that we're learning, and whatever else is happening, how the teacher treats other students, how they might treat us as a person, should not get in the way of us taking on board the knowledge, the skills, this body of information that we need to master in the time that we have. Because the time that we have as a student is very limited. And I'm not just talking about, learning in a school, in those years of learning, but actually even in a university, the different subjects that we have, the time that we have to be familiar and understand this body of knowledge is limited. We want to make the maximum use of that time, and not be distracted by sort of thoughts of how other people are being treated, how we are being treated. Essentially, the teacher is simply a conduit, is a means by which we can understand this body of knowledge, this learning, scholarship, if you would call it. And we are the main drivers, the masters of how much we learn. The teacher is really the middle, say. And so whether or not they are doing their jobs in terms of whether they are skilled, whether they are delivering in the right way, controlling the classroom in the right way, that should not distract us from our main aim, which is to be across the information and these skills and the knowledge in the time that we have, which is often very limited. In our particular university, UWTSD, there's block teaching, in which case in the BA program, there's about 5 to 6 weeks for each particular module. And you might think there's a lot of time, but actually for that particular body of knowledge in which some scholars spend their entire lives researching, that's actually quite a limited time. So you want to spend that time wisely. And if you have this attitude or these feelings towards the teacher or certain classmates, then that's going to get in the way of this learning. So it's an opportunity to be focused on your learning and to understand the triggers for you to be distracted. Okay, so there's the teacher again talking to that student, or there's that teacher again doing this, and that sort of leads to different feelings. But when you notice that, you realize that actually you've lost track. Your attention should be on this particular subject. So actually, you can see through that analysis whether it's the teacher's lack of training or the way that they're actually teaching and how they might treat you. All of these things are periphery because you're there as a student. You're responsible for your learning. And the teacher is really just a guide. So in the time that you have, you want to maximize it. Getting angry at them, it doesn't help. So there are much better ways to cope with this kind of these situations. And the Exalted Treatise here tells us that it's better to be productive, to have constructive emotions in which we think about, okay, well, here's the situation, here's this, how do we make the most of the situation and these resources, the time that we have. So you can see that being angry towards our teachers is not productive. And on top of that, because of their particular position, that perhaps is the Exalted Treatise is telling us it also leads to demerits. We shouldn't give rise to these feelings, full stop. We should neutralize these feelings and think about how this person is giving us a different learning opportunity and how we can make the most of that. Now, this then leads us to the next sentence, which is about our parents. And in fact, you realize that the way that we deal with the people around us, whether it's at school, our teachers or classmates, actually is derived and comes a lot from how we deal with family members. So the sort of basic emotional intelligence that we learn at home is then extended to our other relationships outside the home. And therefore, being angry towards teachers and opposing parents sort of is the same idea, that they're not productive at all. And in many ways, it goes counter to this the idea that we have these certain responsibilities that we have to fulfill. Now, the parent and child relationship is, I would say, one of the most important relationships in traditional Chinese thought traditions, particularly in the Confucian tradition. So we've all heard of the virtue of family reverence, so how we care and honor and respect our parents. Now, with our parents, then you might say, well, there are times when we feel that we disagree with our parents. And that, or we may have feelings of opposition. Okay, so as we said, as you can see here, confronting them, wanting to counter their thoughts or their ideas. Now, there may be a number of reasons again for this. So sometimes these reasons are quite justified. So in the traditional understanding of the parent-child relationship, parents had certain responsibilities. So parents needed to, at a very basic level, provide for the family. So provide in terms of, as we know, 3 meals, make sure children, their family members are clothed, fed, they have accommodation, shelter, and they're able to thrive physically. Okay, so that's at a very basic level. But then from a traditional perspective, the more important role is to nurture them from an education point of view, provide them with educational opportunities. Now, we're not talking about simply formal education, the kind of education that is compulsory from the ages of 5 or 6 in Australia and other countries. We're talking about the education that happens before this formal schooling, in which case the parent is ultimately serves in the role of a teacher or a guide, you could say. And much of this learning and education doesn't necessarily take place in the form of classes or lectures, but actually through how the parent conducts themselves. It's kind of learning through emulation or teaching by modeling that behavior. And so parents were expected to model the right behaviors, the thoughts, words, and actions, values, etc., that the children would pick up and take into later in their life, and would also be further honed, refined through the learning of texts such as the Exalted Treatise, Confucian texts, etc., in their formal schooling through the teacher. So it was to be these formative years were crucial to developing the thought patterns, the habits, motor skills, etc., that would lead to good character and ultimately being, this responsible citizen that would contribute to the community. From a Confucian perspective, this kind of learning is to help us achieve our innate potential, our innate humanity, and ultimately become a sage. So the parents were actually the very first teachers that a child had. So this is, very simply, these were their responsibilities. And so if the parents were not fulfilling these responsibilities, let's say, for example, the parents don't work, and it falls to the children to have to work and study. The parents are unwell in some way. They are unable to model the right behavior. They're not educated in this. Then there's children will naturally feel that there's something missing, and they might want to. Then they would feel this disagreement, or you could say want to confront their parents. So this particular line then is not to say that you will never disagree with your parents. It's how you do that, and the idea that opposing parents in a way that is counterproductive. So I'd like to come back to the words of Xunzi, who we saw before, and he provides as a particular chapter in this text, the Xunzi, which is the way to be a son, or in this case, a child, how to relate to our parents. Okay? And in the first part of this chapter, it explains there are certain situations in which the child who is a filial child, a child who is someone who really loves and cares for their parents, does not follow the instructions of their parents. So this is, you might say, they disagree with their parents. So let's look at this. What are the three cases? The first is when the instructions will actually endanger their parents. And so the child will obviously not follow these particular orders. Very simple example, you're taking your mother or your father to a medical appointment, you're rushing, the light goes from yellow to red, and your parents are like, well, just go through the lights, we're in a rush. Obviously, you would not follow this particular instruction, because this would not only endanger yourself, your parents, but also other people on the road. The second scenario, or the second case, is when such instructions would disgrace your parents, and it's not right. So, very simple example again, you're in the supermarket, long queue, parents want you to push your way to the front, Well, obviously, that would be disrespectful to people who've, waited in the queue. This would obviously be embarrassing to yourself, your parents, etc. So you wouldn't follow that particular instruction. And the third is when their instructions require you to do something that would be against ritual propriety, that would be against etiquette and sort of proper human decorum, you could say. And therefore, you would not follow that order, but you would still be respectful. So you can see here that all of these different scenarios is not about yourself. It's about thinking of the best interests of your parents. And in that case, even if you oppose them, even if you disagree with and don't follow through on what they say, it's still filial piety or family reverence. So it's very clear here. There are certain responsibilities that we have as a child to ensure that, our parents, we truly care for our parents. And then Xunzi concludes by saying that, we should understand when to follow and when not to follow the orders. But on top of that, it's not just disagreeing, flatly refusing, and, criticizing them in public. It's actually about, regardless of whether you follow or not, and you understand that, you have to still be reverent, respectful, loyal. So always think about their interests. Be trustworthy. What you say, you'll do. If you don't say it, if you don't promise it, then you won't do it, obviously. You're scrupulous, so you're very attentive, and you're able to carry out these things, so these being reverence, loyalty, etc., vigilantly. And this is called the greatest filial piety or family reverence, how you treat your parents with this love and care. And so he concludes the introduction by saying that you follow the way. This is the way of humanity, the way of being a sage. That's well described in the text. You follow the way and not your leader. You follow rightness, which is another way of talking about the way, and not your parent. So if it's not right, and even your parents ask you to do it, you should refuse, and that is filial piety. So you can see that this opposition is not the opposition of that is explained in the Exalted Treatise of just confronting them, offending them. It's actually being clear about why and when you might disagree, and doing that with respectfulness and still with love and care. Now, Xunzi, in his chapters, he provides a summary. So, very nice, concise sort of explanation of these principles, but then he also uses anecdotes. So the following anecdote is about Confucius. And even though Xunzi and Confucius, like Mencius, Mencius and Xunzi did not live in the same time as Confucius. They never met. Right? But during that time, of course, these anecdotes were very prevalent, and he makes use of them in his text. So this is a story about Confucius. He's in attendance of the Duke of his state of Lu, and the Duke asks him about this idea. Does this child have to follow everything their parent says in order to be filial, and does the subordinate have to follow everything that the Lord or the leader orders in order to be faithful? And that's his question. And he asks this 3 times, but Confucius remains silent and doesn't answer. Now, we'll realize in a second why that might be difficult for Confucius to answer this question. Clearly he is the leader of the state, and he's asking about whether the subordinate has to follow everything that he says. So maybe if Confucius had some difference of opinions, it might be difficult to say it to his face. So what happens is that Confucius later goes and he sees his student Zigong, and then relates this question and asks what Zigong thinks. And Zigong says, Well, of course, filial piety means that a son has to do everything that their parent says, and fidelity or faithfulness means that the subordinate, the minister, has to do everything that the leader of the Lord orders, doesn't it? And this is Confucius's answer. So he says, in the past, now Confucius is, 2000 lived 2,000 years ago, but he's talking about the past. So in the good old times, when the leaders, the ministers were well educated, well learned, he's talking about the good old times. Now, in the past, if the state could field 10,000 chariots. Now, this is in relation to the size of the state. In the past, the state, these states were not measured, the size were not measured by economic capacity like GDP or population, but through this idea of its military capacity, through the number of vehicles. The war vehicles used in warfare. So 10,000 war chariots it's talking about here, 10,000 war vehicles, which was considered to be the description of a very large state. And in fact, in the times of Confucius, it would refer to the military capacity of the Zhou king, who basically ruled over the central states at that time. So this is, we're not just talking about population here, we're talking about military capacity, a very large state, powerful state. And if this leader of the state had merely 4 ministers that would be able to criticize them, their policies, their strategies, their conduct that might be, not conducive to the public good, to their interests, to the public interest, just 4 of these ministers would be enough to ensure that the territory, the boundaries of these states would not be reduced. In other words, they would not be invaded. They would not be a weak state that would, be attacked by neighboring states. He continues by saying that a state that could field 1,000 chariots. So this is, what we would say a feudal domain at the time, a smaller state. But this state, the leader, had just 3 of such ministers that might oppose the leader should they see some deficiencies in the policies, etc. Then its altars of soil and grain would not be endangered. So altars of soil and grain refers to the kind of sort of sacrifices that were made for the particular spirits of the soil and grain that represented ultimately the state itself. So the state would not be endangered. And you can see why, because obviously the ruler has to take into account various opinions, different ideas, have full consideration before making their decisions. And these ministers might provide or present opposing opinions, differences of opinions that might not be so popular, but would be necessary in order to have a comprehensive understanding of the situation. So Confucius then continues, okay, well, then there's a state of just 100 chariots, so a smaller state now, but it still needs, just 2 ministers to ensure that its ancestral temple, the temple in which the leader would commemorate their own ancestors, would not be destroyed. So whether we're talking about the territories or boundaries or the altars of soil and grain or the ancestral temple, we're talking about the stability of the state here. And you can see it's all contingent on these types of ministers. 4, 3, or 2, there's not many that are needed, but they're needed. And the key element is that they're able to stand up for sometimes an unpopular position, but a necessary position for the leader to understand and make decisions. Now, going back to the main topic, which is the family, parent-child relationship, a parent who has this son who will oppose them or provide some sort of difference of opinions will mean that they are able to, protect the family's interests. So the parent here is really a representative of the family leader, will ensure that this extended family, the entire family household, will not be jeopardized through the leader acting in ways that might lack ritual propriety and offend other families, etc. A well-bred man, a scholar, someone who's well-educated, cultivated, they need a good friend who's able to tell them when they're doing things that are not right. They're able to remind them of what's important, and so that they don't lose their social standing, their good character, and they don't do things that they would regret. So you need that kind of a friend to tell you when you're wrong. And therefore, if a son simply obeys their father, how would they be considered filial? If a minister simply obeys their lord, how would that minister be considered faithful? So to be careful about the cases in which one obeys another, this is called filial piety. This is called fidelity or faithfulness. So in the first instance, in relation to parent-child relationship, the fidelity is in relation to the leader-subordinate relationship. So you can see that here, in the words of Confucius himself, not just Xunzi, but Confucius is saying that the responsibilities of a child, even as a young child or as an adult, they need to be clear about what is in the best interests of their family, their parents, and to do that is the greatest filial piety or filiality. And being in these difficult situations in which maybe your parents might be imperfect in some way, they're not fulfilling their side of the, being that leader, that guidance, that mentor, that role model. Sometimes that helps you to understand and come to grips with your own responsibilities. So regardless of what they do, you still have to, as a child, fulfill your own responsibilities to realize your own humanity. So as it says here in the same chapter, Xunzi explains that, yes, we may face some sort of physical exhaustion. We may be physically challenged, but it's important to not lose our respectfulness, especially towards our family members. We may face some sort of calamity. So this is not just physically, but it could be mentally, some sort of hardship, trials, tribulations, but we have to still not cut corners. We still have to do things according to the rules, according to the right way, this rightness. And even in the case that you may be misunderstood and your relationships might be strained, you may be hated because your parents don't understand that what you're doing, you're not following their instructions, but actually it's for their benefit. You may be hated, but you don't lose your love or your care for your parents. That is where this humanity develops and is cultivated. So therefore it says here, no one but the person of humanity, Ren, can do this. It's in these situations that we develop our humanity, that we realize our innate potential. And this is ultimately how we become a better person, a sage in the Confucian or Taoist or even Buddhist tradition, to improve our moral character, but also our understanding of life and how to really relate to others. And it's often these trying times, whether you come across a teacher or parents or older siblings who may not be fulfilling their responsibilities, that doesn't stop you from fulfilling your own. Just like the teacher shouldn't stop you from fully understanding and mastering that scholarship for your own good, but also for the good of humanity. Parents, older siblings should not get in the way of you realizing humanity. And in fact, it's through these opportunities, through these circumstances, these often challenging circumstances, where you are tried and tested. You may not have that role model in these, they should be leadership figures, but they're not. So you have to turn back to the records, the books, the texts, to find your footing and it really tests your understanding of these ideas. What is right, and what should I be doing in this situation? It's turning around. It's changing your emotion, how you relate, how you react in these situations to these people. You not to be angry or opposing them, which would strain the relationship, but continuing to care for them, to treat them in a respectful way. And it's through that you have this opportunity to then later in life help them to change. So this learning is not just about your own personal well-being and happiness, but it's also about having the ability to help your family achieve personal well-being, happiness, their own humanity, and even those beyond the family in the community. So you can see how just being angry or just opposing others, confronting them, is a demerit, because the greatest harm is not done to others but to yourself, to your own cultivation, to your own focus, to nurturing your own potential, to developing your own potential. That's where the harm is. And therefore, that's why the Exalted Treatise really sort of directs our attention to these lines. It's a misdeed, yes. We will have demerits, but more importantly, what does that mean? It means that we don't realize our own great potential. So I'll leave you with those thoughts. Thank you very much for listening, and look forward to exploring the next sentences with you next week. Thank you very much.